There is a number, a very specific number, written in pencil, in a small, precise hand, in a column of other numbers on a page of an accounting ledger in a private office in Manhattan. The date is sometime in the early 1940 seconds. The number represents the net present value of a specific ongoing operation, calculated across a 5-year projection period, adjusted for operational risk and law enforcement exposure, and the specific cost of maintaining the key personnel who make the operation possible. The key personnel include one specific individual whose continued presence in the organization is generating a line item on the positive side of the ledger. His continued presence is also generating, on the risk side of the same analysis, a different kind of cost. The specific risk that this individual represents, the specific exposure that his continued association with the organization creates, the specific vulnerability that comes from having someone who knows certain things, who has done certain things, and who has begun, in ways that the organization has noted with increasing concern, to behave in ways that suggest his interests and the organization's interests are diverging. When the interests of a key personnel member and the organization diverge sufficiently, the financial analysis changes. The line item on the positive side shrinks or disappears. The line item on the risk side grows. At some point, the calculation tips. The net present value of the key personnel member's continued association with the organization becomes negative. And when it becomes negative, the organization makes a decision. Meyer Lansky does not make that decision. That is important to understand. He does not sit in any room where the decision is made. He does not vote. He does not authorize. He does not instruct. He does not know, in any legally usable sense, what the organization does with the analysis he provides. He is the accountant. He runs the numbers. He presents the numbers to the people who make decisions. What those people do with the numbers is their business, not his. But the numbers are his. The analysis is his. The specific financial framework through which the organization evaluates its personnel decisions, as it evaluates every other kind of decision, is the framework that Meyer Lansky built. And within that framework, the question of whether a specific individual continues to be more valuable alive than otherwise is a financial question as much as it is any other kind of question. It has a quantitative answer. The quantitative answer is calculable, and Meyer Lansky is the person in the organization who is best positioned to calculate it. This is the story of the accountant and the ledger, and what the ledger contains. Not the explicit story, because the explicit story is sealed inside the financial records that never became public evidence, and inside the minds of people who are decades dead. But the structural story, the story of how a financial architecture designed for the management of illegal business necessarily incorporates, as one of its variables, the specific financial value of human life, and of the man who built that architecture and lived with what that meant for 50 years. The Accountant of Death. The title is not one that Meyer Lansky ever used for himself. It is not a title he would have accepted. He was, in his own understanding of what he was, a financial architect, a person who managed the money of complex organizations, a person whose specific expertise was in the movement and protection and growth of capital. The death was incidental to the finance, not the point. Never the point. But incidental is not the same as irrelevant. The financial decisions Meyer Lansky made and the financial analyses he provided existed in a context where the stakes of getting the calculations wrong included outcomes measured not just in dollars, but in lives. His numbers existed in a world where bad numbers had consequences more final than bankruptcy, where the correction of a financial mistake sometimes involved correcting the person who created it, where the line between financial management and something much darker was drawn not by the accountant, but by the people who used his work. He understood this. He had understood it from the beginning, The world he entered when he was 13 years old, the world of the Lower East Side street gang that evolved into the national syndicate, was a world where violence was an operational reality. Not the primary tool, not the first resort, but an available and occasionally necessary instrument. He was not naive about this. He never pretended to be naive about this. What he did was build the architecture of his participation in this world in a way that kept the violence as far from his specific function as the structure of the organization permitted. He did not plan operations. He did not direct personnel. He did not authorize the use of force. He managed the money. The money existed in a context that included the possibility of violence. He managed the money. The context was the context. He managed the money. This is the specific moral architecture of Meyer Lansky's life. Not the absence of moral awareness. The construction of a moral position that acknowledged the context while claiming exemption from it through functional specialization. He was the accountant. The accountant's job was to keep the books. The books recorded what happened. They did not cause what happened. Whether this moral architecture is defensible is a question that different people have answered differently for a long time, and will continue to answer differently. What is certain is that Meyer Lansky constructed it deliberately and consistently maintained it for 50 years, and that the FBI and the Justice Department and every prosecutor who ever came after him was never able to demonstrate in a legally sufficient way that his functional specialization was not what he claimed it was. He kept the books. The books recorded the outcomes of decisions made by other people. The connection between his numbers and those decisions was real, but not, in the legal language that matters for prosecution, provable in the specific way required to convict. The Bugsy Siegel case is the most personal and most documented instance of the pattern. Siegel is Meyer Lansky's oldest friend, his partner of 30 years, the person he has trusted and protected and fought alongside since they were 13 years old. He is also, by the late 942nd, a financial problem. The Flamingo construction overruns are creating an organizational crisis. The allegations of skimming from the construction budget are creating an organizational crisis of a different kind. Meyer Lansky investigates the Flamingo finances. This is his job. He is the financial architect. When the finances of an organizational project are questioned, he is the person who determines what the numbers actually say. He runs the analysis. The analysis produces a result. The result is not what anyone hoped it would be. He presents the analysis to the organization. He presents it accurately because that is what he does. He does not soften the numbers to protect his friend. He does not adjust the analysis to produce a more favorable conclusion. He presents what the numbers show because the integrity of his function depends on presenting what the numbers show. An accountant who adjusts the numbers to protect specific individuals is no longer useful as an accountant. The value of his work is its accuracy. The organization receives his analysis and makes its decision. Meyer Lansky is not in the room when the decision is made. He is in his apartment in Manhattan. He has done his job. The decision is not his job. June 20th, 1947. Ben Siegel is shot in Beverly Hills. Meyer Lansky is in New York. He receives the phone call. He sits very still for a long time. He has known, in the specific way that the accountant knows things, what the calculation looked like. He has known for weeks what the calculation looked like. He has presented the analysis that contained the calculation. He has sat with what that meant every day between presenting the analysis and the night of June 20th. And then his friend is dead, and the calculation is complete. And Meyer Lansky, who managed the money and not the decisions, carries the knowledge of what his management of the money produced for the next 36 years, until his own death. This is the texture of what the accountant of death means. not a person who kills, a person who calculates with total precision and total accuracy in a context where the calculations have consequences that include death. A person who has separated his function from the consequences of his function with a moral and legal precision that protects him from those consequences, while not protecting him from knowing that the connection exists. The specific cases in which Meyer Lansky's financial analyses preceded violent outcomes are not publicly documented in a way that would survive legal scrutiny. The connection between his work and specific violent events is a matter of inference from circumstance rather than documentation. But the organizational logic is clear. The organization used financial analysis to make decisions. Meyer Lansky provided the financial analysis. Some of those decisions involved the removal of people who had become liabilities. The financial analysis was part of the decision-making process. The conclusions follow from the premises. He knew they followed. He was too intelligent to pretend they did not follow. The specific quality of the moral architecture he built was not the absence of knowledge, but the construction of a position within the organization that was technically separate from the decisions that the knowledge informed. Technically separate, not morally separate. He was not claiming moral separation. He was claiming functional separation. The distinction matters legally. It does not make the sleepless nights less likely. By every account from people who knew him in his final decades, Meyer Lansky was a man who slept poorly, who woke in the night and could not return to sleep, who had a quality of interior distance in his most unguarded moments that suggested a person carrying something heavy in a private place. Whether this was the specific weight of what his calculations had contributed to, or whether it was the accumulated weight of 50 years in a world where violence was ambient, is not something he ever said directly. What he said, in the closest thing to a direct statement he ever made about the moral texture of his life, was that he had done what he had to do, that the world he operated in was the world he operated in, and that operating in it required certain things, that he had tried to do those things in a way that was consistent with his understanding of what he owed to people and what he was responsible for. He did not say more than this. He changed the subject. The accountant of death, the man who kept the books in a world where the books included entries that most accountants never encounter. The man whose mathematical precision was applied to questions that most mathematicians would refuse to address. The man whose functional separation from violence was as real as the organization's structure permitted, and as complete as the conscience of an intelligent man could sustain. He managed the money. He presented the numbers. He kept the function and the consequences in separate compartments with the specific discipline that 50 years of practice in maintaining difficult separations had given him. He was not the one who pulled the trigger. He was not the one who gave the order. He was the one who knew what the numbers said. And in a world where the numbers were the last word on every question, including the ultimate questions, that specific knowledge had a specific weight that no amount of functional separation could entirely remove. The accountant, the ledger, the numbers that preceded the outcomes. The man who built the architecture of a financial system that processed everything the organization did, including its most final decisions, and who lived for 80 years with the full and precise knowledge of what that architecture contained. The accountant of death. Not as a celebration, not as a condemnation, as the most accurate description available of what it meant to be the financial intelligence of an organization for which financial intelligence was applied to every decision, including the ones measured in more than money. If this story of the specific moral weight of being the most indispensable person in the most consequential criminal organization in American history, of the man who did not pull the trigger, but whose calculations informed those who did, moved you, subscribe to this channel, because the full story of what Meyer Lansky was and what he carried is the story of a kind of complicity that no legal framework has ever fully addressed, and no moral framework has ever fully resolved. Drop a comment. Tell me whether you think the accountant bears responsibility for what the numbers produce. And remember this: The most dangerous person in any organization is not the one who acts. It is the one who knows. Meyer Lansky always knew. He lived with that knowledge his entire life. So did the people who depended on his knowing. So did the people the numbers were about. There is a specific quality to the knowledge that an accountant in Meyer Lansky's position carries. It is different from the knowledge of the decision-maker who knows what he has decided. It is different from the knowledge of the executor who knows what he has done. It is the knowledge of the person who has seen the numbers and understands what the numbers mean and what the numbers require before the decision-maker decides and before the executor acts. This foreknowledge is a specific burden. Most people who are implicated in harmful outcomes are protected, to some degree, by the speed of events. Things happen quickly. There is not always time to fully anticipate the consequences of actions. The compressed timeline provides a kind of moral shelter, not an excuse, but a mitigating circumstance. The incomplete understanding that precedes an outcome that nobody fully saw coming. Meyer Lansky had no such shelter. His specific function was the accurate projection of outcomes. He was the person in the organization who saw the future most clearly, because he was the person whose job was to calculate the future most rigorously. When he ran an analysis that produced a specific result, he understood what that result meant before the result was acted on. He had time with the knowledge, days, sometimes weeks. The time between completing the analysis and learning that the analysis had been used. This is the specific weight that the accountant of death carries. Not just knowing after the fact, knowing before. Carrying the knowledge in the interval between the calculation and the consequence. Living with the result of the calculation as a number on a page before it becomes a fact in the world. How a person manages this kind of foreknowledge is a question that has no clean answer. You can compartmentalize. You can tell yourself that your function is separate from the decisions your function informs. You can remind yourself that the decision-maker is the decision-maker, and your role is the analysis. These are all true things. They are also not sufficient for an intelligent person to entirely close the distance between the number and what the number becomes. Meyer Lansky was an extremely intelligent person. He understood the distance between his number and what his number became. He understood it with the same precision he brought to everything, and he lived with that understanding for 50 years, in the specific way that people live with things they have no choice but to live with, not denying, not confessing, carrying. The people closest to him describe, in the accounts that survive, a man who was fully present and fully engaged with his family and his grandchildren and the ordinary pleasures of his final decades, and who simultaneously had a quality of interior distance that never fully closed, who could be deeply in a conversation and somewhere else at the same time, whose attention, at unguarded moments, would go somewhere that was not in the room and would stay there briefly before returning. The specific distraction of a person who is always carrying something that has nowhere else to be put. This quality, which the people who loved him noticed, and which they interpreted as the weight of his professional life in general, may have been the specific weight of the accountant's knowledge in particular. The accumulated foreknowledge of an entire career, the specific mathematics of human value, in a world where that value was calculated with the same precision as commodity prices and operational risk. The knowledge of what the numbers said about specific people before the numbers were acted on. Over 50 years of providing that knowledge to an organization that used it. The moral philosophy of functional separation is old and genuinely contested. The arms manufacturer who does not fire the weapons. The defense lawyer who does not commit the crime they defend. The accountant who does not make the decisions the accounts inform. Each of these positions involves a functional separation between the work and its consequences that the worker claims as moral insulation. In each case, the claim has merit. In each case, the merit is contested by people who argue that providing the instruments and the analysis that make harmful outcomes possible is itself a form of participation in those outcomes. Meyer Lansky's position in this debate is the extreme version of the accountant's case. He was not providing financial services to a corporation that happened to have harmful downstream effects. He was providing financial services to an organization whose primary activities were illegal and whose decision-making processes included, as documented across decades of investigation, the specific decision to remove people who had become organizational liabilities. His work was the core function of that organization, not a peripheral service. His analysis was the input to decisions that included those specific decisions. He was not the decision-maker. He was not the executor. He was the accountant. And in the specific world he inhabited, being the accountant was the most powerful position available, more powerful in its way than the decision-makers who depended on his numbers, more powerful than the executors who acted on the decisions. The accountant who sees the future most clearly, who provides the numbers that determine what happens, who is the indispensable input to every significant organizational outcome, occupies a position of functional power that his technical separation from the decisions does not diminish. He knew this. He constructed his position deliberately to maintain the functional separation while exercising the functional power. The separation protected him legally and provided a degree of moral insulation that he may or may not have found sufficient. The power made him necessary. The necessity made him safe. The safety allowed him to do the work. The work informed the decisions. The decisions produced the outcomes. The accountant of death. The chain is complete. The separation is technical. The knowledge is total. The weight is permanent. In his last interview, given to a journalist in the early 1980 seconds when he was in his late 70s, Meyer Lansky is asked a version of the question that has followed him his entire life. Not about the specific cases, not about the specific numbers, about whether he feels responsible for the things that happened in the organization he served. He pauses for a long time before answering. The journalist records the pause. Then Meyer Lansky says, in the specific, measured language he has always used for the most sensitive subjects, that he is responsible for what he did. He is responsible for his work, for the accuracy of his analysis and the integrity of his numbers and the quality of his financial management. That is what he is responsible for. He does not say more than this. The journalist presses. Meyer Lansky looks at the journalist with the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for 50 years and has long since stopped expecting anyone who hasn't carried it to understand what it weighs. He says that the question is an interesting one, and he has thought about it. Then he says he would like another cup of coffee. The journalist gets the coffee. The subject does not return. That is the full public record of Meyer Lansky's engagement with the question of what the accountant of death owes for the deaths that the accounting informed. A pause. A statement of responsibility for his function. A request for coffee. Everything else, the 50 years of carrying the knowledge and the foreknowledge and the weight of what the numbers said and what the numbers became, exists only in the quality of the interior distance that the people who loved him noticed and which he never explained. The ledger is closed. The accountant is gone. The numbers he wrote still exist somewhere in the same offshore architecture that protected everything else he built. The numbers do not explain themselves. They never did. The people who understand what the numbers meant are all dead. The knowledge died with the man who carried it. The weight is gone. The ledger is closed, but the question is not closed. The question of what responsibility the accountant bears for the outcomes the accounting informs is a question that lives in every professional context where precise analysis is provided to decision-makers whose decisions may cause harm. It is a question that will be answered differently by different people in every generation. Meyer Lansky's version of it, the extreme version, the version where the outcomes included the ultimate outcomes, is the version that makes the question impossible to answer comfortably from any direction. He carried it. He kept working. He lived to 80. He never answered the question publicly. And the ledger, wherever it is, contains the numbers, precise and accurate and written in a small, careful hand, the accountant of death, and all the numbers that description requires to be accurate. Let us make the abstract concrete with specific cases where the organizational logic is most visible, not with the intention of definitively establishing causal chains that the available evidence cannot establish, but with the intention of showing how the financial architecture and the consequential decisions overlapped in the specific cases that are most documented. The Dutch Schultz case is one of the earliest and clearest illustrations. Schultz, in the mid-1930s, is proposing to the Syndicate's leadership that they authorize him to arrange the elimination of the special prosecutor who has been building a case against him, Thomas Dewey. This proposal reaches the Syndicate's governing structure because any action of that magnitude requires organizational approval. And the organizational evaluation of this proposal runs through the standard process of risk analysis and benefit analysis that Meyer Lansky's financial architecture has institutionalized. The analysis is not favorable to Schultz's proposal. The short-term benefit, the elimination of the immediate legal threat, is substantially outweighed by the organizational risk. Killing a prominent special prosecutor in New York City would provoke a law enforcement response of a scale and intensity that would threaten every operation the Syndicate runs. The financial analysis of what a prosecution-driven crackdown in the aftermath of such a killing would cost the organization dwarfs any benefit achievable by removing Dewey. The analysis points to a different conclusion. The problem is not Dewey. The problem is Schultz. As long as Schultz is proposing actions with this risk profile, he represents a threat to the organization. The financial calculus of Schultz's continued association with the organization, when the specific risks he is creating are included in the analysis, tilts negative. The organization makes its decision. In October 1935, Dutch Schultz is shot in Newark. The Dewey prosecution proceeds. The organization is not exposed to the law enforcement escalation that would have followed from Schultz's proposed course of action. The financial logic of the analysis is vindicated. Meyer Lansky is not documented as having been in any room where the Schultz decision was made. He is documented as having been the financial architect of the organization that made the decision. The analysis that preceded the decision used the financial framework he built. The conclusion it reached was consistent with the financial framework he built. The distance between his architecture and the outcome is real, but not wide. The Abe Reles case represents a different kind of illustration. Reles is a key witness in the Murder, Inc. prosecutions of the early 1942s, a former member of the enforcement arm of the Syndicate who has agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, and whose testimony represents an existential threat to multiple major figures in the organization. He is in protective custody in a hotel in Brooklyn, guarded by police, waiting to testify in a series of trials. From an organizational financial perspective, Reles represents a liability that is quantifiable. The expected value of the prosecutions his testimony would enable, measured in terms of the convictions that would follow, the operations that would be disrupted, the organizational capacity that would be lost, is enormous. The organizational benefit of his testimony not being given is correspondingly large. The calculation is not subtle. In November 1941, Reles falls from the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. His police guards are asleep. He is killed. The witnesses who would have testified in the subsequent trials are gone. The prosecutions collapse. The men his testimony would have convicted are not convicted. The specific mechanism of Reles's death has never been officially established as anything other than an accident. The official explanation, that he fell while attempting to escape from his police protection, has been regarded with skepticism by virtually every serious investigator who has examined the case. The alternative explanation, that someone arranged for his fall with the cooperation of the police guards who were not watching, is consistent with the organizational resources and motivations that existed at the time. Meyer Lansky is not connected to the Reles case in any document that constitutes legal evidence. He is connected to it in the organizational logic that every analysis of the period consistently returns to, which is that the financial architecture of the Syndicate identified Reles as the most significant liability the organization faced at that moment, and that the organization had both the motivation and the resources to resolve that liability. The financial architecture that identified the liability was Meyer Lansky's architecture. The motivation the architecture produced was the motivation that led to whatever happened at the Half Moon Hotel. The resolution of the liability that followed preserved the operational capacity of the organization in a way that had quantifiable financial value. The accountant's numbers, the organization's action, the outcome. There are others, not named here because the documentation is thinner and the conclusions more inferential. But the pattern across the documented cases is consistent. Financial analyses that identify specific individuals as liabilities are followed, after intervals that vary in length, by the resolution of those liabilities. The resolution is not always violent. Sometimes people are bought. Sometimes they are moved. Sometimes they lose interest in the problems they represent. But sometimes the resolution is final, and in those cases, the financial logic that preceded it is always visible in the organizational record. Meyer Lansky is the person who built and maintained the financial framework within which that logic operated. He did not design it for this purpose. He designed it to manage the financial resources of complex criminal enterprises in the most efficient and most legally protected way available. The application of that framework to personnel decisions is a consequence of its comprehensiveness, not a specific design feature. But comprehensive frameworks have comprehensive applications. A financial architecture that evaluates all organizational decisions through a quantitative risk-benefit lens will evaluate personnel decisions the same way it evaluates operational decisions. The ledger does not discriminate between types of decisions. It calculates. It presents. The decision-maker decides. The executor executes. The accountant keeps the books. The accountant of death. The man who did not kill. The man who calculated. The man whose calculations, applied in the context they were applied in, informed outcomes that no accountant should have to calculate and no numbers should have to represent. The man who kept the books in the fullest possible sense, who knew what the books contained, who carried what the books meant. For 50 years, until the ledger was finally closed. The specific texture of being the accountant, in the particular sense this story uses the word, requires one more examination before it can be fully understood. It requires looking at what Meyer Lansky did in the intervals between the calculation and the outcome, in the days or weeks between when the numbers said what they said and when the world confirmed what the numbers said. He kept working. This is the most important fact about those intervals. He did not stop. He did not go to ground. He did not spend the interval in visible distress or visible reflection. He continued to do the work that the organization required, with the same precision and the same discipline that characterized everything he did. He continued managing the operations. He continued reviewing the financial reports. He continued making the calculations that the organization needed made. This is not evidence of callousness. It is evidence of the specific quality that made him what he was, which is the ability to hold multiple things at once without allowing any one of them to displace the others. He could be genuinely aware of what was happening, carrying that awareness in the full and uncomfortable way that genuine awareness requires, and simultaneously be doing the work that his function required. The awareness and the work coexisted. Neither eliminated the other. This coexistence is the most demanding thing that Meyer Lansky's specific position required. Not the calculations themselves, which were technically demanding, but emotionally separable from their consequences, if you chose to separate them. Not the management of the financial architecture, which was complex but comprehensible. The coexistence. The ability to do the work while fully knowing what the work was part of. The ability to be present in both the professional function and the moral awareness simultaneously, without the moral awareness destroying the professional function, or the professional function anesthetizing the moral awareness. Most people cannot do this. Most people who encounter genuinely difficult moral terrain either suppress the awareness, which produces a kind of functional sociopathy, or allow the awareness to overwhelm the function, which produces paralysis. Meyer Lansky did neither. He maintained both simultaneously throughout a career of 50 years with a discipline that was extraordinary, regardless of how you evaluate the choices he made. Whether the choices he made were defensible is a separate question. Whether the position he occupied was morally coherent is a separate question. The discipline required to maintain that position, the specific capacity to know what you know and do what you do, and carry both things simultaneously without surrendering to either of the easier options, is recognizable as extraordinary even by people who find the choices that required it indefensible. He was not a simple person. He was not a person whose life can be summarized in a single characterization. He was the accountant of death in the specific sense that his accounting informed fatal outcomes. He was also a man who loved his family and helped his community, and built things that created legitimate employment and genuine entertainment, and a city that did not exist before he helped build it. He was both of these things at the same time for his entire life, without the contradiction ever fully resolving. That unresolved contradiction is the truest description of what Meyer Lansky was. Not the criminal who happens to have some redeeming qualities, not the flawed hero whose crimes can be contextualized into insignificance. The person who was genuinely both things simultaneously, in full awareness, carrying the weight of both for 80 years, and who died still carrying it, with the ledger closed and the books balanced, and the account of what his work had cost and what it had built left permanently and deliberately uncompleted. The accountant kept the books. The books contained everything. He knew what was in them. He carried them his entire life. When he died, they went with him. The final entries, the final balance, sealed in the offshore architecture that holds everything he built and everything he knew. The accountant of death. The books are closed. The numbers are still there.